music. There are a number of stories of Mother Matrina. She's a nun in the early Christian church and a prominent saint in the Roman Catholic, Eastern Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox Church. Here's one of those stories. A young doctor came to see Mother Matrina. He said, "Mother, I cannot bear all the suffering I see or hear every day. It's just too much for me. I can't understand why God allows such suffering to exist in the world." And she replied, "There is no way for us to understand the existence of suffering. We must learn just to bear it with as much courage and love as we can find. This is the only answer to the problem of suffering." And then he exclaimed, he said, "But this does not make it any easier to bear." And Mother Matrina, she said, yes, I know. But to find an easy way of bearing it is not what we are about. Every person has experienced suffering at least once in their life. Many, if not most, have experienced it multiple times. Because of the universality of suffering, each of the world's religions, as well as spiritual and philosophical traditions, have attempted to address the existence of suffering and how to bear it. One good example is the Buddhist Four Noble Truths, which say dukkha, or suffering, is an innate characteristic of existence. Samadaya, or the origin of suffering, arises from tanha, or craving, desire, or attachment. Nirodha, or the sensation of suffering, can be attained by the renouncement or letting go of attachment. The Noble Eightfold Path is the path leading to renouncement of attachment and cessation of suffering. I'm sure that you have experienced when, as most people do, when they're in that midst of suffering, when they're feeling that so profoundly, that it is a challenge. And it can cause you to doubt whatever beliefs or religious or spiritual beliefs that you might have, wondering, how could this be? How could this happen to me? Why would a loving God, allow suffering in the world? When we experience suffering, we're feeling powerless, trapped, useless, afraid, while also experiencing psychic and or physical pain. And all we want to do is for it to go away. And in our lives, we try to avoid it. No one wants to experience pain or suffering. And we see the pain and suffering of others. At least some of us. At least some of the time. Feel connectedness with others. So much so that we experience some empathy for what they're going through. And are moved to show them compassion, particularly if their suffering is somehow linked to our lives or to our own experience of suffering. But many people, perhaps even us, or some of us, either ignore or numb ourselves or even avoid being aware of the suffering of others. When we see someone suffering, how do we decide to let their suffering in? How do we decide to feel empathy, to show compassion? When suffering, or even being with someone who's suffering, brings up such complicated and multifaceted feelings and reactions. Orthodox Christian author and lecturer Irma Zelinsky writes, "No religion or philosophy can make any sense to us unless it teaches us not how to understand suffering, for that's not really possible, nor how to feel empathy with those who carry its burden, but how to bear it with them." In other words, religious or philosophical teachings must address compassion. But I wonder if we can learn empathy, particularly for those who are suffering. Now, Zelinsky doesn't think so. But I looked up the definition of empathy, and I wondered. Empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And I looked it up, and I found that definition. I also found the definition that describes it as a skill, something that can be learned. And we heard earlier that Leslie Jamison thinks it's a skill. She said empathy isn't just something that happens to us. It's also a choice we make to pay attention, to extend ourselves, to make an exertion. Sometimes we care for another because we know we should, or because it's asked for. But it doesn't make our caring hollow. The act of choosing simply means we've committed ourselves to a set of behaviors greater than the sum of our individual inclinations. This confession of effort chafes against the notion that empathy should always rise unbidden, that genuine means the same thing as unwilled, that intentionality is the enemy of love. But I believe in intention. I believe it takes work. My friends, when I think about empathy, I think of kind of two ends of a spectrum. Two experiences particularly come to mind as I think of these two ends. One is that of experience of being with someone I care about who's suffering, someone that I feel very deeply for. And the other one is of a person that I see on the street, perhaps sitting on a sidewalk, walking among cars at a stoplight, perhaps asking for donations. Both of these bring up a variety of feelings in me: pity, fear, sadness, guilt, uncertainty, powerlessness. With someone I love, these feelings seem to be unbidden. They rise up and are pronounced and powerful and impactful. They're difficult for me to ignore. However, when I see a homeless person. I sometimes find these feelings not so quick to activate my empathy. For someone I don't know, empathy, I believe, is not always unbidden. It doesn't mean we can't feel it and we can't be with that person. But sometimes it's not unbidden. Sometimes it has to be intentionally activated, like a skill, learned, practiced. I find that the more often I don't activate or exercise empathy, the less I have to deal with the downer emotions of others. And I do that because my mind, well, it thinks crazy things sometimes. It makes me think there are good reasons not to feel empathy. To ignore the feelings of others. I rationalize to myself saying, all that stranger is doing is going to buy alcohol or drugs with that money. Or that person probably works for an organization that hires them to get out here and get handouts. Or I've seen on the news that there are people out there who make a good living, who come out and panhandle for just a little extra money. Or how do I know? How do I know if that person in front of me is really in need or is really suffering? Should I allow myself to activate and practice empathy for someone who might not be suffering? Should I stop and open myself to empathy for everyone I come across? Even in these two extremes, the loved one and the stranger. How can I predict how much empathy is enough? Could I get overwhelmed, exhausted, feel taken advantage of? And what's the point of empathy? Does it do anything tangible to reduce the suffering of others? And yet with all that, my thoughts, my feelings, my wonderings, I have to tell you, I choose empathy. I choose to stop and recognize the suffering of a stranger. Even if it doesn't feel entirely genuine, or powerful, or effective, even if it requires work. You might wonder why. Why would I do such a thing? It's a choice for me. It feels like the right choice for me. It's who I choose to be. An empathic person who gives attention to those suffering in need. I have to be intentional about it, though. If I want to be that person, if I want to act on empathy, and if I want to build that skill so that I can feel the suffering of others, I feel like I have space in my life, in my heart, where I can do that. And so I wonder for you, as I'm talking about myself, I wonder, what did you experience when we did that meditation? It was a meditation on empathy. Were you able to open up to the pain of someone? In this case, someone you care about. What did you experience? Did you feel the pain coming in? Did you feel that center of compassion, that indestructible peace inside you, that healing and loving force inside you? And what did it mean to you when I talked about breathing out light or transforming the pain? My hope, my friends, is that this meditation informed you in some way, might be useful to you as you continue your journey of learning whether you want to activate or improve your skill of empathy. And what about compassion? I think it's a skill as well. And I really believe, that we have this compassion inside of us and that we have an abundance of it. Some might call it loving kindness, that's in all of us. That's in our core, that holds us. And if we tap into it, it can be helpful in caring for ourselves and for others. I know that you may wonder, do I have enough inside me to be able to offer it to someone else? Don't I have to take care of myself? Well, I agree. I think it's important for all of us to use that core of compassion to care for ourselves, to think of ourselves. But I also think that we have more than that. I know I have to tell you from my own experience that I was a psychotherapist for almost 30 years, and I saw a lot of people suffering. And I developed a coping strategy so that I was very focused on caring for myself, and I limited how much I was able to give compassion to others. I limited it to protect myself. I was afraid I would run out of my own resources of self-love and self-compassion and self-care, attending to the needs of so many others. I had to shut down some of that empathy and overly limit my compassion. I guess I'd say to you, what I've learned is that awareness of self-care is important. In fact, it is life-sustaining. However, I do now believe that we have a lot of compassion within us, and that balance of self-care and the needs of others for empathy and compassion is not a static point on a continuum. Balance has a range of motion, movement. And as we change within, and as our circumstances change without, we can learn where that balance is. And I know it's possible to lean one direction or the other too far. I've experienced it. But I believe in sort of a middle way, moderation. And that's, each of us has to find that. Because I believe that we are called to care for ourselves and to care for those in the world. I think many, if not all of us, know that. And I'm not here to judge anybody's balance of how much self-care or other care you bring into your life. But I would invite you, as I do for myself, to be attentive mindful what that balance is for you. So that, for me, I choose to be generous with my empathy and compassion. I'm going to go back to talking about compassion a little bit more. Zelensky also writes, "We do not understand compassion. We might think of it as pity, as feeling sorry for the suffering of others. Or we might think of it as mercy, like an act of forgiveness or a deed of kindness, an offer of help. Or like God's compassion, forgiving others for their sins, or Christ's compassion, mainly in terms of his miracles and feeding the multitude, or Buddha's loving kindness in terms of his desire to help others, other beings, find liberation from suffering. In other words, we tend to view compassion as an attitude or action directed toward others, a kind of bending down to someone as someone more powerful and more fortunate to those who might need consolation or help. And compassion does involve an experience of pity for others and a desire to alleviate their pain, but it is more than that. Compassion, above all, is a willingness to share in the suffering of others, to be present to them in their pain and bear it with them. And how might you bear it with them? It might be to hold their hand, to sit with them, to pray or meditate with them, to listen to their thoughts. Compassion is not about what we feel or think or even do, but what we are. The gift of presence. It's another word for love. So my friends, as we live in the world, we can make choices about showing empathy for another's suffering, giving the gift of our presence, compassion, sharing in another's suffering, loving them amidst of suffering. There are a number of ways to do this, but I believe there's some intentionality that you need to bring to it. If you want to improve those skills, if you want to be able to reach out to those in need. And so I want to share one with you today. As I said, there are others. And I use a metaphor from a Buddhist mindfulness to suggest one way to bring these skills more actively into our lives. Our minds are like puppies. One moment they're investigating a bug, the next they're chewing on the sofa, the next they're stuck behind a washing machine. Does that sound familiar? Our minds are like puppies. They're constantly darting between distractions, creating imaginary futures, replaying past events, and getting lost in overanalyzing every experience. I think that's probably, you've got the idea. When training a puppy, one of the first things we do is to teach it to sit and be still. We hope to accomplish something similar for our minds during meditation practice. In meditation, we choose to focus on one thing. Our breath, a mantra, an image, something. Whatever the object is, the purpose is the same. To be mindful and fully in the moment, instead of chasing after thoughts and emotions. Empathy and compassion are all about being fully in the moment, despite the many things, both internal, like rationalizations or fear of being overwhelmed, and external, like the many perceptions and events that call out to us every moment, that distract our attention. If we decide to make empathy and compassion central aspects of how we live in the world, we have to build these skills through focus and attention. Being mindful with the intention of empathy and compassion. And when we are distracted, gently bring our attention back to empathy and compassion. In other words, sit, stay, be empathic and compassionate in the moment. And you do that again and again and again. And this is how we practice. Now, it's obvious, I think, that we can't do this every moment of every day. But with every behavioral change, as we try to bring this into our lives, it will happen. Perhaps slowly. Perhaps we might not even be aware of the change as we do this, as we use this strategy to strengthen our empathy and compassion, until at some future time we are suddenly more aware, we're a little more empathic or compassionate than we used to be. My friends, I invite you into this practice of bringing the idea of empathy and compassion into your life over and over, into your perceptions, into the way you live in the world. But don't look for change to happen. That will not make it happen any quicker. In fact, it's likely to make it slower. Because if you keep looking for it to happen, you're distracted, letting your puppy mind wander around sniffing out whether or not you've changed. If you choose this practice, increasing the skills is about awareness and intention and patience and time. And one last thing. In this space in which we share our journeys with one another, we can support one another in our learning and our work. Here we can affirm one another's choices and actions as we move toward being more authentic beings. And that, for me, makes this a holy place. A place where we can practice this newfound skills of empathy and compassion, cultivating it in our lives with the support of others. As Unitarian Universalist Reverend Andre Moll says, when I show you that I hear you, when I say your life matters, that's where compassion begins. When I risk my comfort to ease your suffering, when I act against hatred, violence, and injustice, that's where courage begins. When we experience the full presence of each other, because of our shared humanity, because of our differences, this is where holy gratitude begins. May this sanctuary, this congregation, be a place of beauty where together we can create such miracles, and where we share, and when we share, and how we share is sacred.